Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi Achint. A lot is happening in China, and that's something that we need to look at. It's been called a labor uprising in China. Uprisings are far less that we hear in China as much as they happen. Is that the case? Is China hiding all these protests from plain sight? Do we know the amount of people that protest in China on a daily or a yearly basis? And what are they asking for? These particular protests, of course, are for the COVID restrictions which are being put across. The first thing that actually broke out was of the company called Foxconn, which produces iPhones in China. And these guys basically broke the barriers, jumped across, walked the roads, and got out of the entire place. Things seem to have calmed down, but again, a replacement staff was brought in. They were promised a certain amount of money, and things kind of went haywire after that. So there have been protests there. There have been protests in Xinjiang. There have been protests in many other places. And as a matter of fact, there have been some online protests which have been happening in China. We need to understand what's happening behind the red curtain in China. Before I get into it, I've got some slides up for you where we dig into the history of why protests are critical in China, what is the CCP kind of scared of, and some analysis as to what's going to happen going in the future. Before I do that, guys, like this video, subscribe, please hit the bell icon. And yes, if you can, do contribute to the Dev Talks efforts by becoming a member. Yesterday, thank you, Naveen, who actually sponsored the memberships for a lot of 4 or 5 of other members on Dev Talks. I'm grateful. Of course, yes, if you can, please do, as I said, contribute to the Dev Talks efforts through becoming a member, clicking on the super chat or super stickers, or you could directly contribute to me towards the UPI mentioned below on the screen. Don't forget to visit the website at www.thedevtalks.com. Let's get into it. There is something happening in China which we need to understand, and I'm going to just switch on the slides so that we could get into the details of it. Now, I follow some certain accounts on Twitter, and those of you who actually, those of you who actually follow me, you'll be able to figure out what's happening in terms of China on Twitter. Especially, there've been a lot of videos which are being going around with regards to the protests. So it's being termed, and if you see the hashtag, it's Labour Uprising in China. COVID lockdowns with no end in sight. Why are these words being used? It could have been called a COVID protest. It could have been called an anti-Xi protest. It could have been called a protest in China, anti-lockdown protest. Why a labor uprising in China? That is because we kind of missed up on a little bit of a China history lesson. There is something behind this entire thing which we don't know about, and that is that the people's protest or the labor's protests have always been central in Chinese political transformation. So if the Chinese governments have fallen in history, not just the CCP, before that, it has been because of labor protests. And that's something that we need to understand. I'm going to, there have been many other protests and stuff like that have happened in China. Let me just run through a couple of them and give you a little bit of a background to what I'm trying to say, right? The first thing that I'm going to talk about is 1911 revolution. I'm not going to go too much into the details of this because, it'll get a little too much into the game. This was basically at the time when the Chinese were being ruled by the Qing dynasty. The country was very weak after the opium wars were fought. Opium dens were all around the place. People were addicted. The Britishers played a pretty nasty game with the Chinese. And of course, this particular revolution, funnily, started from Wuhan. And that's something we need to remember. What had happened was Sun Yat-sen, who had basically led this uprising, was able to overthrow, not really overthrow, but sideline the Qing dynasty and the ruler of that time. He was, made a sort of a namesake and establish a, nationalist government of his own. There's also another one which has happened, which is known as the May 4th movement. This happened right after the First World War ended in 1919, and when the Treaty of Versailles had taken place, there were certain German holdings which were there in China that were supposed to be transferred to Japan. And the people rose up and they created a lot of hangama. There was a lot of protests. Labor that entire thing went through, which was basically the start point of the two parties that we know, the two political parties that we know of in China. One today, of course, sits in Taiwan, and the second one is in CCP itself. The first one that I was talking about is the KMT. Incidentally, the KMT today, as a matter of fact, has won some local body elections in Taiwan. A little bit of antennas are going up. Which side is this going? But I digress. Let's come back to the subject. 1949 was another big protest, where protest and a revolution, as per se, when the CCP took power from the nationalists and drove the nationalists out into the island of Formosa, or today as we know it as Taiwan. Of course, there were another big protests, and I'm talking about in 2002 and 3, 2010, which was again incidentally in Foxconn. So we'll go through a couple of these. Let's see what is there. I've told you about the 1911, and I've told you about the May 4th revolution. The 2002 and 3 protest was basically done in Tibet, Chanping, Sichuan, Shenyang, and Tianjin. This was a mass protest with regards to the treatment of workers. Of course, Chinese consider these workers as commodities. They're not wanting to kind of treat them properly, and there's a lot of exploitation that happens. This, of course, this entire thing, as you can see, of course, 2004, the camera resolutions of the images that would have been pulled out of that particular protest aren't very great. But in the right hand side of the image, you can actually see the army being brought in. So this, my friends, is what the Chinese do. When kind of things go up to a certain point, they'll allow it. After that, to crack it down, they'll bring in the army, they'll hit the sword down, and they'll do what needs to be done to restore the balance, as per se, as per what they call. Now, the army has also been seen on the road some time ago when there were bank protests. There were tanks that were brought onto the road, and I'm sure all of you have seen those videos. So I'm just trying to establish a certain point that army would be pretty much the last resort. 2010 protest again was Foxconn. So there's a lot of similarity, right? And if you can see what I'm trying to say, there's a build up and there's a historical connection to what is happening today, and that's one of the reasons why this whole thing is being termed as the Labour Uprising in China. 2009, Sun Yong Dang, who was basically Sun Dang Yong, I'm sorry, who was a worker in the Foxconn, he committed suicide along with many other people who jumped off the roofs and did a lot of very sad things during that particular time. Very bad pay conditions. Of course, please do understand Foxconn is a Taiwanese company. There was also strikes in the Honda plants and the Toyota plants, and you can see the pictures that I've put across that I've found, where in the first picture they were basically burning effigies of Apple products during the office of Foxconn in Hong Kong. So there was a lot of protests that took place around this thing, and this was a little bit of a issue because this was corporate protests. So there, in China, you've got something called online protest, offline protest, corporate protest, government related protests, and so on and so forth. They've got kind of categories. They've got a categorization system. There are so many of them that they have to do that. Which comes to my next question. Are strikes common in China? In the spring of 2008, as I write here, a local union official described strikes as natural as arguments between husband and wife. You can imagine, right? He's trying to basically tell you that, yeah, these are pretty common, nothing to be this thing about. The Chinese government said that mass incident. Now, protests can be of various kinds. They can be 5 guys standing with a flag protesting, or they can be a large amount of people that collect together and do things. So when I'm talking about protests today, it's about the mass incidents. It's about large things. It's about what we see on our TV screens and on our mobile phones today with the videos coming out of China. The incidents grew from 8,700 a year in 1993 to 87,000 in 2005. By the way, this Chinese government used to take out these figures, and after it reached 87,000 in 2005, they stopped giving out these figures to the rest of the world. Sun Liping, who's a sociology professor in the Tsinghua University, said estimated 180,000 protests in 2010, or 490 protests per day. You can imagine what I'm talking about. China is a large country, but 490 protests per day. I mean, there were two citizen journalists, Lu Yuyu and Li Tingyu. They've been documenting this between 2012 and 2016, 15, 16. They documented about 28,000 such mass occurrences from worker strikes, environmental demonstrations, anti-government protests, and what we, similar to what we see today. Uh, in 2016, these guys were kind of put behind the bars, and a lot of the data. Now there are certain companies that track this, certain websites and certain organizations that track this data coming out of China. So a lot of the data kind of stops at 2016 because these guys were put inside, and a lot of things didn't come out after that. This is what I was talking about. This is called the China Labor Bulletin. This is a graph that will tell you about very, very massive. I mean, I was talking about massive protests. I'm talking about crazy massive protests where hundreds and thousands of people came onto the road and protested against certain government policies, or whatever issues that they were facing. Between the year 1990 and 2022, 16,252 major incidents took place of today and beyond type. And as a matter of fact, that tells you it is 738 protests per day. Sorry, per year, which is almost two major incidents happening every day, right? And this is like explosive protest. What I was talking to you about is a collection of people demanding something, and this and that doesn't go into an explosive sort of a scenario. So these are explosive protests which are coming out. This is a graph that shows you where the protests happened, not considering November right now, just before November. This was till the, I think the figure was till about September. This is the graph that shows you the protests that have happened in China in 2022 itself. And again, these are mass incidents. These guys sit abroad. They were in Hong Kong. Now they sit abroad. So they are kind of tracking this down with whatever little information that seeps out of China. So it's very interesting that they've done this. I was talking to you about online protests. I didn't want to kind of cover the online protests because I've given you certain hints before in my program with regards to COVID in China. But I thought, let me just cover it for a little minute because I found these little things. Somebody had written an article, and I found it to be a little funny. So I thought, let me just put it across, because we know Xi Jinping as Winnie the Pooh. There's another nickname for him that the Chinese have kept. So let's read. Wang Jiangfeng, a netizen from Shandong, was sentenced to 22 months in jail in April 2017 when he jokingly referred to the Chinese president as Si Baozi. Now, bao is like a steamed bun, it's like a momo dim sum sort of a thing, but it's a little round and it's a little dense. He basically called Xi Jinping a steamed bun, and then he called him a Maoist thug online. The punishment, of course, he got was 22 months. Now, Baozi or steamed bun has been the Xi Jinping's nickname within China because he went to some restaurant in 2013 and started praising these buns and this and that. And the Chinese said, "Nahi, yaar, buns are not that important in Chinese cuisine." But since he was talking bun, they kind of said, "Okay, you are Baozi." So they kind of gave him a nickname. The nickname Baozi also has a negative connotation, which is known as Tubauzi, which is called a country bumpkin. You know what's a bumpkin? Pretty much a idiot, for the lack of a simple word. I want you guys to take some time and visit this channel called Rubao on YouTube. I don't know this person, but I've been seeing this. It's funny as heck. He does a lot of memes on Xi Jinping. I mean, he picks up gaffes and he picks up a whole lot of things and he mixed them up together with some music, and it's this thing. This guy supposedly, a lot of people say, was based in China till very recently. He's just gotten out of there. So it's an interesting thing how these Chinese people are kind of expressing themselves online without circumventing the Chinese rules. Of course, the opposition bandits, they call themselves as fanzai, uh, and they talk about these battles with these little pinks, which are there. And as a matter of fact, if you go onto Twitter and you type hashtag Wumao, WUMAMAO, you will see a lot of pretty much war sort of a thing happening between these Chinese who sneak out from their VPN and get onto Twitter, create an account to kind of troll and trash people. And there are certain, anti-CCP activists which are there who would hit them, who would get them blocked, who would, push them into a corner and make sure they abuse or something like that and get them blocked right there. So this is sort of a war, and this is what I say, that the Fanzai also regularly engage in Tongta, which means the push against the tower. They're trying to shake that entire tower of the CCP to kind of see if it falls, you know. So of course there is a problem in China with regards to the uprisings which are happening with regards to COVID and this and that. But if you will see a lot of the anti-CCP handles, they want to propagate it very hardcore to ensure that it reaches the large amount of the world. And I don't blame them, right? And I've been retweeting all their videos, so I don't blame them. They're trying to do what they wanting to do with regards to their own country. The Shanghai residents during the lockdown created a very interesting online language where they were using code words, you know, to kind of, push across their protest. They would ask, "Have you felt the air in your hair?" That means, have you gone outside? So they will, they would put it in these romanticized words, and they would have conversations online. The CCP did get wise about it, and they kind of cracked down a little bit. But of course, these codes keep evolving. Uh, I have not put it on the slide, but let me tell you, when this Beijing protest happened, and this guy put up that thing on the Beijing bridge and stuff like that. He was called a bridge man. Uh, Beijing, or China, for that matter, the CCP blocked the search of Beijing for a little bit so that people don't kind of get into this entire thing. A lot of interesting things were done by the Chinese during that time, and one of them that I remember is basically what the Chinese were doing was they were keeping their Bluetooth on, and they were transferring these, when they were walking down the streets. They would, air they would transfer it through Bluetooth. It's on iPhones, it's called air transfer air or something like that. So they would push this message across to people whose Bluetooth was on, and they would kind of see that this particular message is actually sent across to people. So that's something very interesting. And as a matter of fact, after this whole thing finished, the Chinese blocked this particular facility of transfer because this was seamless. There was no thumbprints or fingerprints that you could find. So a lot of information was spread across. A lot of words were written on the back of toilet walls and stuff like that. If any of you want those photographs, I have them. A lot of stuff was written under carpets, over, in the ceiling somewhere, and a whole lot of things. So people did find very innovative ways of protesting in China. Now, social uprisings, I don't want to get into a lot of social uprisings. There have been a lot, as a matter of fact, but the three big ones that I see is the 1989, which is the Tiananmen Square massacre. I think all of us know about that. The Tibet uprising, which happened in 2008. This was because of I think the Tibetans saw an opportunity and cracked it during the Olympic year. And of course, the 1920 Hong Kong umbrella movement, which was, projected in front of the world. In 1989, we know what happened. Students got together, and this photograph is iconic. Please read this, and this is right in front of Mao's photograph right there. It says, "Give me freedom or give me death." So it's an iconic photograph. There are documentaries that have been made out of this. People smuggled film out of China and kind of have very few footages of what exactly happened. We remember the story of the tank man. We remember how the crackdown happened, and we also know that approximately 10 to 12,000 people were killed during the crackdown of this particular thing in one night. So it was a very sad and very violent sort of a protest that took place. This is about the Tibetan uprising in 2008. Now, in 2008, the Tibetans were, I won't say celebrating, they were commemorating the Chinese takeover of Tibet. 49 years, and they kind of tried to take it a step forward because 2008 was the time where the Chinese were doing the Olympic. So they wanted to, push their message across to the world stage. Uh, they were obviously, the idea was to do it on the 50th year, 50th anniversary, but they kind of preponed it, and there was a huge protest that came out. Tibetans have had protests in China, but mostly what has happened is the protests within the region of Tibet has been limited to Lhasa. This particular protest spread through the entire place. A whole lot of monks were arrested. They were shot. A massive crackdown was brought across, and that's one of the reasons why today China again is very sensitive about Tibet. So whenever India does a little bit of fingering with the Dalai Lama, you see the answer coming back really fast. So that's what it is. This, of course, is the umbrella movement, as it's called, in 2019. This was after the extradition law and, of course, the national security law that was brought in by the Chinese. in violation of all the treaties that they've had with the UK. It's a violent protest. People are still facing jail time. People are still in jail. A lot of people have confessed, as a matter of fact, to uh, whatever charges that the Chinese had, because I don't know what the kind of pressure that these guys would be putting across. So Chinese crack when they do crack down, they crack down hard. I'm sure you've seen these videos floating around on the internet of these guys dressed up in white in that those hazmat suits beating the living daylight out of people on the road. It's a very very sad this thing. I wanted to put across some weird news. Why I want to put across some weird news is because these kind of things are like the trigger. Now, I've just taken three, four things. These are the kind of triggers that you see with regards to the start of a protest, right? Protests are because of something. Of course, people have been locked in today, no food, no nothing, 2 times a day testing and this and that and the whole shebang. Here, a very interesting news that I saw, which happened in the past sometime. State-owned bus company in debt asks employees to take out personal loan to cover unpaid wages. The company is supposed to pay the employees, and they're telling the employees you take a loan and cover yourself with the wages. So that's, of course, people are not going to like that. The CLB, which is I was showing you uh, the tracker that I was showing, the strike map showed 1093 worker strikes, which is an increase of more than 200 from 2020. This takes the total actions closer to the pre-pandemic level of 1385 logged in 2019. Again, these are strikes, means strikes, worker strikes, which actually happen in factories and this and that. So of course not violent and this and that, but these guys would just sit down with these flags, and there's enough photographs of these online. There's a very sad perception that the Chinese media is closed and this and that. Yes, they are, but they've also put out a lot of things. Funnily speaking, I don't know why, but they do. More than 2.7 million migrant workers that basically come from rural areas into urban areas. You know why they come? They want to earn money and send it back to their parents and build their house and this and that. 1% of them were not paid on time in 2015. You can only imagine, I'm talking about 2015, right? You can only imagine what's happening right now when your factory production output has dumped, when your economy is dumping, your real estate market is going down, you're trying to spend more money in terms of your military, and you're trying to re-regularize your entire thing. Your budgets and your expenditures in terms of internal security are going up. You can only imagine the kind of cash crunch a lot of Chinese corporates might be facing today. Today, as I've been saying through this video, is that these protests were happening because of COVID lockdowns. Large scale protests happened, as I said, in uh, as a matter of fact, day before yesterday or yesterday in Lhasa. So these Tibet protests normally, are centralized to that entire area. The rest of the place is so vastly populated. I don't know if COVID is actually reached in those areas or not. Uh, there's a person who was interviewed by Voice of America. It's a newspaper. It's a radio site as well. He said, "Who knows what's the real number of COVID cases are now? Every day we hear people in the need of oxygen. The government can report whatever numbers they want. Those of us in India, those of us who remember the second wave, I hope that rings a bell. If there's a person who's saying we can hear people who need oxygen in China, where communication isn't that free amongst individuals, if not if you're in one-on-one contact, you can imagine what's actually happening within that country in terms of the crisis that they're taking place. As a matter of fact, they've reported one death. I don't know if that is true or not. They've reported one death yesterday from in Beijing from a COVID this thing. And as a matter of fact, a lot of localities within Beijing itself are getting locked down. So they're not doing a citywide lockdown in Beijing because it'll stop the entire government. So they're doing community sort of section lockdowns. Hundreds of people have been protesting in Urumqi. Urumqi is the capital of the Xinjiang province, which is, of course, the Uyghur area. What happened is there was a building where something kind of went wrong, and there was a fire. About 10 people died, and people have been protesting, and they've been saying, "Lift the damn lockdown and stop this brutality." And there are lots of very very hard slogans that are being spoken in that. Foxconn, as I said, have been locked for weeks now in the major protests. Uh, there was a dispute that happened with regard to a certain amount of bonus that the company said, "Okay, you stay here, produce, we'll give you the bonus." End of it, they said, "No, no, no, we can't give. There's something this and that and all that." So the entire thing broke out into a violent protest. There was a news that came out. I can't confirm this. Foxconn offered 8,000 yuan to its employees to say, "Yeah, please stop protesting. We'll give you money. Take the money. Shut up. Don't protest." And this is what they were trying to do. So this is again basically even in a communist system, the union and the collection of people have a certain power on the government and the authorities, and they do win. And if they're willing to offer in the first shot, you can imagine once you sit down what will happen. Some snapshots of the Foxconn protest, you can see the weather. It's horrible. It's terrible, full of smog and this and that. And then you've got these white guys, barely can see them in the background. And on the left hand side, the photograph shows a violent breakout. People are throwing stuff at each other. There's a short video. Of course, I don't want to show it here because of copyright issues and stuff like that. But you can follow me on my Twitter. You'll be able to see it. Some more news that came out of China. Deadly fire, as I said, stirs anger in China's Urumqi province. Because the city was locked down, the fire engines took a lot of time, which created the entire building has gone up in flames. So it's a bad situation there. China's iPhone city placed under COVID lockdown after violent crashes. So the immediate knee-jerk reaction of the CCP was what? Lock it down, stop it, right? Maskless. Now, this is something I want to talk about for a little bit. Before I do, guys, please put in your comments or questions or anything like that going forward, so that we can take that. I don't want to make this a long video because I'm trying to just put up across a certain point with regards to China. This is not a larger situation that we are analyzing. It's probably a very tactical situation that we are analyzing, which may have a larger outcome. Of course, maskless World Cup. Now, there's a huge cry out within China that came out, and there were people making videos and stuff like that. They were saying, "Yeah, what the hell? If you go to this Qatar is happening." They were questioning Qatar, what kind of COVID policy you have here. Why is it that we have to wear masks and you guys are not wearing masks? What is this? We are still locked in and you guys are jumping and jiving and doing whatever you want to. I want the same Chinese people to remember when we were stuck in the second wave. Xi Jinping had organized for a pool party in Wuhan and declared a victory on the virus. Who's actually won is a question that the Chinese people need to ask themselves. And this probably is the right time to do it. I've shown this photograph before. It makes me snicker and smile every time I see it. Jimmy, 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 Aja, 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 which was a Buppy Larry remix song. I'm not very sure. I'm not very good in movies. So if I say something wrong, please don't, get after me. Jimmy is basically give me rice. And it's a very sad thing. This guy's, in this particular video, he's kind of showing an empty bowl of rice, that we don't have food. It's pretty bad. A big question that all of us may ask, we've also been through lockdowns. We went through the first one, we went through the second one, and we also had a third mini sort of a lockdown in certain places. Why are lockdowns so harsh in China? Why are they doing it so badly? What's happening? That's a good question. But I also ask this question, what else can they do? They don't have a choice. They wasted almost 2.5, 3 years touting about a vaccine that is nothing more than dirty water. It's creating a lot of backlash in terms of reactions. There's got 200 noted reactions or something like that. Apart from what everybody believes, the health system in China is not that great. They've got the least amount of ICUs amongst, I won't say the developed part of Asia, but the developing part of Asia. So they've got one of the least amounts. The lower than them is probably Pakistan and Sri Lanka and stuff like that. But they've got a very, very bad situation in terms of their medical facilities. And we saw that, if you remember, go back to the videos that came out of Wuhan. They were crazy. People were piled up in the pathways and stuff like that. And that's also another thing that the Chinese have been building. We see this. Oh, great China! They built up a hospital, 10-floor hospital in 9 days and 10 days and this and that. Oh, भाई साहब इतने सारे हॉस्पिटल बना रहे हो, मतलब नहीं है तभी तो बना रहे हो ना यार. You don't have your hospitals. That's why you're making them. And yeah, Chinese construction, when they take 3 years to make something, it still falls. I don't know how long this 10-day long hospital will last. Another study, I am not saying this, has come out from a study group. It's not an official WHO study group or anything like that. It's a study group based in Sweden, if I'm not mistaken, which spoke about a certain lesser immunity amongst the Chinese people. I'm not trying to be racist. This is just a report of a study. I don't know if I believe it or not, but it sure does look like it. Uh, the question that I still want to ask, yeah, the lockdowns in India were done to ensure that the cases kind of came into control. When the cases used to explode, yeah, people separate people, put them in their houses, and the cases would calm down, and then slowly, slowly reopening would happen. I know it's a story that all of us will remember for the rest of our lives. I don't think I'm putting anything new in front of you, but in spite of the lockdown, yesterday, day before yesterday, and today have been one of the highest number of cases in China. That's funny, right? You're locking people down, but the cases are still high. The insanity of the Chinese and their style comes to you when you see these pictures of people piled up in a football stadium or something like that for their daily COVID tests. They're just piled amongst each other. So you can imagine when you're putting people together for this daily COVID test, what's going to happen? They're going to spread the infection. I mean, if the Chinese had half a brain, they'll know that, but I don't think they're using it right now. Of course, with the amount of testing that they're doing to these, even 1 million or 2 million or 3 million tests a day, you can imagine the waste that the Chinese are creating. There was a study that was being done about Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken, and they said Hong Kong generates 60 tons worth of rapid action tests, those little, white things, on a daily basis. So that's the kind of, this thing, and it's putting a lot of pressure on Hong Kong landfills and stuff like that. COVID policy will not change. Why? Now, this is something I want you to, go back to the discussion I was having with General Ravi Shankar, where we came to a surmise that the Chinese, this whole zero COVID policy is not about saving lives as much as it's about controlling the society, controlling the people in China, to have that entire grab in front of them where they the party decides everything. They've also come up with this social credit systems have been there in China for a long time for individuals. This is the first time now they're trying to do it for corporates. Now this tells me something. Did Foxconn say something wrong to the Chinese? If they did, this is what the Chinese will do. A lot of the international companies would be taking a lesson here. यार, if we step out of bounds, ये तो उनको लॉकडाउन लगा देंगे 3-3 हफ्ते, तो हमारी तो entire production will go down. Foxconn, at the end of it, is a Taiwanese company. Although, to be fair, and I'm not trying to protect the Chinese, but to be fair, the Chinese haven't till now got after the Taiwanese companies which are working in China. They've got a very good working relationships, as per se. Let's go to the next slide. Interestingly, this I about a minute before I was about to come online, I was reading the South China Morning Post, and this thing came up as a breaking news. It said, Urumqi to ease lockdown amid unrest over deadly fire. It is very interesting. So the Chinese people over there, or the Uyghurs and the Chinese, and I don't know who all are staying there. I mean, they've blended the entire population. But the people over there, they protested, and the Chinese government had to kind of ease up the lockdown. So that's interesting. And if that kind of spreads further, you know how this kind of stuff goes after that. Now, couple of thoughts. As I said, the zero COVID policy to me seems like a more of a political move than a move to protect the Chinese people and their health. Now, these particular moves which are happening against certain corporates, certain areas where Lhasa, Tibet, Xinjiang, why are they happening in these regions? Is there something that those regions did, or did they protest in a certain way during the election time of Xi Jinping? What happened? Is also another interesting thing. Till 2019, they did not take the names of they didn't consider the instability within Tibet and Xinjiang to be a very forefronted issue. But 2019 onwards, they kind of started doing that. So is this a sense, or is this a hint towards increasing protests within China? The world over, Chinese people, of course, a lot of the Chinese people who are there, uh, they either secretly, openly, or overtly or covertly work against the Chinese government. But let me also say this: a lot of them spy for them as well. So it's not, they're both kinds of people. But a lot of dissidents are involved in these social media storms that we see today, the entire uh, set of videos which are coming out. So there is a way wherein these videos are being channeled out of China, in spite of the Chinese Great Firewall, and that's something interesting to me. Chinese, I'm saying this, Chinese internet sensors are not working very properly. Videos are coming out like crazy. How many of us remember the videos from Wuhan? Probably three, four of them that came out. After that, everything got sealed. Today, I can tell you, today, since the morning, I have seen more than 30 or 40 videos of lockdowns, protests, and so on and so forth within China. Army will be brought in to control this. That will be the last resort that the CCP would use, and that's something I spoke in the somewhere in the middle of my conversation as well. And of course, the CCP and Xi Jinping, who's back in power in his third term, would want to create an example and ensure that this kind of nonsense does not happen with his term. Uh, that is what I wanted to tell you. And it's an interesting scenario. It's not path breaking or anything like that, but it tells you that there is more to China that we know, or that is being told to us. It's also interesting to know that these kind of protests do occur in China. Some very massive protests occur in China, and it's not something very, very new. So a lot of people might just say, "Oh, you know what? There's protests in China. China is going to break up, and this and that, and yeah, well, wishful thinking. Let the Chinese government first kind of figure it out." I'm not trying to be pro-China, but I think I'm going to go by the past precedents where there have been massive protests before as well, and the Chinese have been able to break it down. Remember one thing: if the Chinese have I think about 240 billion worth of defense spending per year, maximum amount that defense spending does not go on buying ships and aircraft and stuff like that. It goes on internal security, putting up these silly webcams, facial recognition softwares, the works in terms of these glasses that the police guys are fitted with, and which is connected to some database where they track criminals and this and that. So there's a whole lot of money that goes within China, right, rather than going towards its defense forces. That's something we must understand. A lot of times I've seen a lot of people comparing the defense spending of the Chinese and comparing the defense spending of India. Please do understand, when the Chinese talk about defense spending itself, it talks about internal as well as external defense. Indian internal defense budgets are obviously much separate. I'm not saying the Indian budgets and the Chinese budgets are the same. No, but a large chunk of that 250, 260 billion dollars goes into Indian internal security for the Chinese. Uh, Another thing I kind of find a little funny at this moment is that these are incidents which are happening right after Xi Jinping came to power. Of course, we know there is an opposition faction within China. The question that we will not I'd like to ask is there something happening at the back that Xi Jinping is trying to curb down to kind of cement his power on the game? Remember, his new cabinet and this and that will come into place somewhere in the 31st of March. The previous guys are still working in their positions, and as the retirements and the movements will happen, his new cabinet or his new group of, uh, you know, the family, if I may, would be coming into force by the March 31st. So, without saying much more, this is an interesting thing. The reason I wanted to do this one for my personal sake, I wanted to find out how many protests happen in China. There was a lot of data there. I didn't want to put it across. This thing would have gotten too boring. And it's for me, it's interesting because I like kind of picking it up. And if you want some data, I'll let me know. Connect with me on WhatsApp or the email which is mentioned here. Uh, it'll be a pleasure to kind of direct you to the right people where you can do your own analysis. Couple of comments, questions, I'll take them through. Of course, they will mostly crush all protests, as I said as well. I agree with you. Look at COVID protests; almost all are crushed. Something seriously needs to go wrong within China to see some serious protests and serious uprisings. This one seems to be a pretty serious uprising. I have not yet put them into a grading system in terms of their severity, but this one does seem to be a little bit of a serious uprising because it's shown a certain violence, which personally, the time that I've researched on China, I have not seen. So it's interesting, but I don't think, I agree with you. I don't think these damn things are going to last for long. The Chinese will give one concession here, one concession there, some money to some guy, some this, and shut them up. Do you think China is losing their manufacturing basis from their own country? Of course, China is a manufacturing market. Manufacturing means it needs consumers. It does not have a very strong internal consumer market, and this is something that I take from the factor that Xi Jinping himself talks about developing an internal consumer market, and not being dependent on the world for the use of their products and stuff like that. So Chinese exports in the last month fell down by I think about 0.8%. Not very great, but for a country which rather mostly depends on its exports, it's quite significant. And if this is a trend which is going to go forward, and with these kind of protests and lockdowns and stuff like that, it will reduce a lot of a lot of the export capacity that the Chinese have. Interesting. There's also another thing which I will take from your question. There's a lot of companies which are moving out of China. I'm not going to be very proud to say that about three or five of them that have come into India. Uh, a lot of them have gone to Vietnam and so on and so forth. But having said that, the companies are moving out of China. So there's of course that game which is also going to happen, which is known as the great decoupling. How fast would people like Germany be able to do it, or Germany is even intending to do it, is something that we'll have to see in the future. Good evening, Vishal. Do you think COVID thing in China will be the final straw on the camel's back to bring about a revolution there? Or do you think it'll take a lot more for the CCP to collapse? See, all the revolutions and all the government changes in China have happened at points of time where the government was really weak. There was nothing within the government. The Qing dynasty I spoke about in 1911, it was reeling after the Opium Wars. The Japanese had, the Japanese had taken over certain territories in the north. Uh, they were in a very disbalanced sort of a scenario. They were not in the right space with regards to their hold over the country. So for a revolution or anything like that to happen, the country's leadership also needs to be rather weak, and the army and this and that must have a division. See, like we talk about the breakup of Pakistan, why isn't Balochistan declaring independence? Because Balochistan, the popularistic movement for that independence is not there. The movement for anti-CCP is amongst a few million Chinese, and it's there. So, but rather most of them are, I don't know, till I think before the pandemic, they were pretty happy with it because they were getting good standard of living, good money, and stuff like that. As things will go down, people will kind of, the millions will, that number of opposite CCP will kind of slowly start growing. So this is a long term process. It's not something that can happen overnight and stuff like that. Rather, in democracies, what happens is the media kind of hypes it up so much that we get these thoughts in our head. In China, that's not the case. It's rather very different. Looking at Foxconn situation, I see why capitalists like China more than India. I mean, they can push workers literally to the brink and get away with it, almost everything. I agree with you, Omer. They had kept these workers in for weeks altogether within the factory. They would give them food and this and that, but just keep them inside there. The first protest that happened at this factory was because of unhygienic staying and working conditions. So it's you. I think you're pretty right. And I'll take the last comment here for the evening. I don't want to last this out for a long sort of an episode. My insight my insight about China is civil unrest controllers are now protesting. Worst case scenario. Uh, there will always be a faction. As a matter of fact, during the Tiananmen protest, Tiananmen Square massacre and all that, a lot of the Chinese soldiers kind of did not want to do this. They initially, when they brought their tanks, if you see the tank man also, that tank guy could have just ran over him, but the tank guy kind of stood there. The tank driver kind of stood there. The tank commander kind of stood there, waited, and this and that. Uh, you know, I wouldn't read too much into these particular protests until unless they go on for a certain amount of time. We've had them going on for about 2 days, 3 days. Uh, Protest will come up to be in an organic vein when it's there for a long time. I was telling you guys yesterday about Balochistan. I don't know how many of you know that Balochistan, there have been a protest on since 25th of October. Nobody's covered it. I read it as a byline somewhere in some article written in the Dawn. So you can imagine these things are this thing, for it to gain that momentum in such a large country with such a large population as China. It'll take a long time and a lot more that needs to go wrong. Remember, the Chinese still have a lot of money. They still have a large. They've not yet used their army to crush this particular protest. So that's, as I said, going to happen. If it doesn't die down naturally, the army will be brought in. let me now say what will be kicked, and this thing should be brought into control. Thanks so much, guys, for I didn't want to drag it to 44 minutes. It's gone on for too long. Anyways, it was just something that I want to put across, that a lot of us believe that the Chinese society is not allowed to protest, or when they protest, the crackdown happens really fast. That's not the case. There have been massive protests that have happened. I have shown you data. If you want more data, let me know. Connect with me, and I'll be glad to share it with you. To join the WhatsApp group of Dev Talks, you can send me an email with a way for me to authenticate you and your mobile number, and I'll send you a link with which you can join the group. Of course, you can please do like this video, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notifications, and yes, of course, please do make sure, if you can, do support and help out the Dev Talks effort by becoming a member, sending us super stickers, or just putting a direct contribution on the UPI. Thank you so much. Till next time, Jai Hind.